This book collects a particular narrative within one of the first magazines to ever come about, the Spectator. There were other magazines in Germany, France, and even Britain itself, but this one was different. And in this particular collection, you get a perfect picture of the Augustan era that merges quite closely with the Georgian. So right at the start of this phenomena, you are getting a good viewpoint of social mores and perspectives, social conflicts. It's a great human sketch, basically. So I will go over some of the important elements here, how it relates to us these days, and give you some motivation maybe to get the book for yourself and read it. So stay tuned. Welcome to biblioCultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video, and I will put below my X account and my Ko-Fi where you can donate recurringly or a single tip. Anything helps, and those of you that have done this already, I really appreciate it. In this episode, I'm going over the Coverley Papers by Joseph Addison. This edition is from New York Heritage Press, and it's from 1945. So it's one of those older books that still maintains its structure. The edition itself is actually a very high quality one, and even though it's almost 100 years old or close to it, I think it has better binding and better paper quality than you find today. That is for sure. But I know you can find plenty of them. I looked online and I saw plenty of paperback editions of this, so you can find it fairly easily and fairly inexpensive. Content is king, so get whichever one works for you. The Spectator was primarily a daily magazine with life sketches and articles and morality tales and that kind of thing. It opened a door also to fictional characters being played out on the public sphere, which was kind of new, and it even engendered a whole culture of investigation into the characters, realizing they were not true people, but maybe based on actual people, and then investigating those people. It was just a social phenomena, and to me, that is primarily the most interesting aspect of it all. It reminds me of Dickens when he wrote about Sherlock Holmes, and people believed he was a real person and would actually try to find him. And this is much earlier. You had people trying to find Sir Roger de Coverley and see if they could speak with him or understand his background, etc., and all the other characters that Addison would add to each particular tale. Now, the author himself explains his motivation for the magazine and also for these kinds of articles. So I'm going to quote it briefly because I think it gives you an interesting introduction to the whole thing. Thus, I live in the world rather as a spectator of mankind than as one of the species, by which means I have made myself a speculative statesman, soldier, merchant, and artisan, without ever meddling with any practical part in life. I am very well versed in the theory of a husband or a father, and can discern the errors in the economy, business, and diversion of others, better than those who are engaged in them. So, as you can see, there's a philosophy behind it, a passive sociological endeavor in this whole process, which is interesting because sociology is a modern phenomenon. And he sees himself almost as an ethnographer or a sociologist of sorts. And that to me is fascinating. It's one of my fields, actually, in my pre-graduate period. Of course, whether or not it is true that you can know better about being a father than an actual father is questionable. And that applies to almost any field. But I get the point. A scientifically minded person can give you a lot of interesting perspectives, for sure. Now, as a fictional personage, Sir Roger de Coverley was a mix of a variety of people. The author knew many sorts that were similar, and he just concocted a combination. But it served him as a way to communicate a lot of values and plenty of maxims on a variety of topics. From advice to clergymen on which way to preach on Sunday, and he actually gives the advice that they should read and quote theologians and poets that are better versed in the topics than they are themselves, thinking that the experience for the parishioner would be improved, and that there's a tendency of many people desiring to be special or unique and therefore feeling compelled to write their own thing. But he's saying a lot of times other people write better than you, than just read their stuff. And I think that's actually very good advice these days. He also uses the character to give moral advice, how to treat domestics, the house servants, and favoring a more familiar attitude, a growing of trust, making them more part of your family instead of just employees, if you will. Interestingly, there's also a very cool chapter on ghosts, and then there's another one on witches in general. And I'm going to read 2 quotes on the topic of ghosts because I actually like the supernatural topic, supernatural horror. So seeing ghost stories or witches in older books is always a fascinating aspect that stands out to me. So let me go through these 2 real quick. Mr. Locke, in his chapter of the Association of Ideas, has very curious remarks to show how by the prejudice of education, one idea often introduces into the mind a whole set that bear no resemblance to one another in the nature of things. Among several examples of this kind, he produces the following instance. The ideas of goblins and sprites have really no more to do with darkness than light. Yet let but a foolish maid inculcate these often on the mind of a child and raise them there together, possibly he shall never be able to separate them again so long as he lives. But darkness shall ever afterwards bring with it those frightful ideas, and they shall be so joined that he can no more bear the one than the other. So you see there this notion that at the end of the day, ghosts and goblins and this kind of thing is primarily an idea of the mind and of culture and of education, which again, it's a fascinating perspective. It sounds skeptical, which it's an idea that seems closer to the Victorian era. Nonetheless, the following quote balances things out actually. Quote, "At the same time, I think a person who is thus terrified with the imagination of ghosts and specters much more reasonable than one who, contrary to the report of all historians, sacred and profane, ancient and modern, and to the traditions of all nations, thinks the appearance of spirits fabulous and groundless. Could not I give myself up to this general testimony of mankind? I should to the relations of particular persons who are now living and whom I cannot distrust in other matters of fact. I might here add that not only the historians, to whom we may join the poets, but likewise the philosophers of antiquity have favored this opinion." So I find it very interesting because it's an epistemological claim from the point of view of authority. Why should I distrust the ancients who testified to ghosts and spirits in favor of modern people in his time that consider all of it to be superstition? So he has a balanced view because he understands that culture and prejudices are involved in a lot of these things, but he also acknowledges that there must be something there because the ancients attest to them, and therefore he trusts them enough to say this means there is value to their testimony. So I find it awesome because it's quite balancing. When it comes to Moll Whites, as the witches were called at the time, Addison is quite compassionate, making the case that most of the supposed witches were just old and decrepit women who fell victim to the prejudice and superstitions of the townsfolk and ended up going crazy and being accused of things that they shouldn't have been accused of. So a very cool perspective in that sense. And I think, as I will mention a little bit later, in the notes, he goes in detail about this phenomena of the witches, the Moll Whites. Addison's presentation of the importance of keeping the Sabbath, the Sunday Christian worship, which is what he meant, is crucial because of how he describes what happens during that period. The moment to reflect, to calm down, to cut the week by separating yourself from the day-to-day. There's a spiritual power in doing this, and I think it's relevant these days because we don't see it the same way anymore. I mean, those that are religious do. and it's a good thing. But what I mean is that most of us grew up with the notion that Sunday and Saturday were just days in which we got a reprieve from the hardships of forced labor. And what I mean is that if we don't work, we don't eat. So we are technically forced to do it. And because we're technically forced to do it, having any free day is wonderful, and it's usually wasted on entertainment, which is fine, but the perspective that should also be used to reflect, to be in silence, is very important as well. An important section dedicated to the phenomena of political parties is to me the most important in this book because it's quite relevant to today, especially for those unfortunate souls who were destined to be born under the corrupt charade that we call modern democracies or republics. And I'm going to give you a quote on that topic as well because I think it's so important. There cannot a greater judgment befall a country than such a dreadful spirit of division as rends a government into two distinct people. It makes them greater strangers and more averse to one another than if they were actually two different nations. The effects of such a division are pernicious to the last degree, not only with regard to those advantages which they give the common enemy, but to those private evils which they produce in the heart of almost every particular person. This influence is very fatal both to men's morals and their understandings. It sinks the virtue of a nation, and not only so, but destroys even common sense. And that is 100% accurate. I'm going to mention the US because of the relevance of the time period that this came out, because the British were suffering this issue of parties. And this is why you see the men like George Washington and John Adams, many of them thought that the worst thing that could happen to their country was the notion of political parties. They were against it, even though eventually they ended up having to collapse themselves into the Federalists, for example. But they understood that if a country developed the party system, it was over because dishonesty, double dealing, corruption was the natural development out of parties. You see that every day today. When the same event occurs on one side, the other side defends it, and when it flips, then it happens in the other direction. No transparency, no decency, no logic, no objective standards of morality, none. It's all party politics. It's all my tribe against your tribe. And a country that is divided like this is basically a dead country. It just cannot function. And the people knew this, which is why I believe one of the first things that should have been put in the constitution of any country would have been a provision that says the political parties are illegitimate. You can associate yourself, fine, but no political party can dictate candidates, amass millions of dollars, billions at this point, and use it as a cudgel to select people and direct people to choose them. Everyone should run as an independent, and it should be completely forbidden to create these tribes. Or you could have a single party system, which I know it's anathema to some people and sounds wild and dangerous. But the truth of the matter is that a single party is still going to have factions, but because they are of the same party, they are basically forced to cooperate. And you see this in some countries functioning actually very well, becoming the greatest economies in the world. Now, again, I'm not a big fan of other elements that you see in those countries because at the end of the day, I'm a traditionalist, so I believe that people should unite under a national banner, under a religious banner. But you either have no parties or have a single party. Once you allow people to hate each other based on affiliation, you have chaos, for sure. And of course, there's a variety of perspective on this. If you have a different point of view, put it in the comments. I love reading those too. Now, finally, before I close this review, the notes on this volume are a must read. So it depends on the edition, because maybe your edition doesn't have the same notes. But if you get the same quality, then they're very important because they give you historical perspectives and it gives you details on, for example, the witch trials that I mentioned during Queen Anne's reign and how people dealt with this fear. And that's valuable information. And I'm going to actually quote one of the notes to give you an example of their value. Each anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's accession, November 17th, was for many years celebrated by the citizens of London in a manner expressive of their detestation of the Church of Rome. A procession, at times sufficiently attractive for royal spectators, paraded the principal streets, the chief figure being an effigy of the Pope, that pagan full of pride. Quote, well executed in wax and expensively adorned with robes and a tiara. He was accompanied by a train of cardinals and Jesuits, and at his ear stood a buffoon in the likeness of a horned devil. After having been paraded through diverse streets, His Holiness was exultingly burnt opposite to the Whig Club near the Temple Gate in Fleet Street. After the discovery of the Rye House plot, the Pope's procession was discontinued, but was resuscitated on the acquittal of the 7 bishops and dethronement of James II. So that's a fascinating tradition that I was actually not aware at all. Never even read of it, so the fact that this was mentioned in the notes gave me a great piece of historical data that I was not aware of. Now, I had read in Pepe's diary certain things that are similar against the Popish cult or whatever they called it, but seeing this entire procession and festivity, to me, it's quite a fascinating thing to imagine. So, to finalize, the rhythm of some of these stories, for modern readers, it will probably be boorish and silly, maybe, but nonetheless, I found them to be pleasant and actually found them relaxing. But even if you wouldn't usually read these kinds of works, the historical knowledge you will get from it is worth getting a copy. It's not too long, so it will not take you that much to read, and I think you will gain a lot from it. So hopefully you enjoyed the review. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video, and thank you for being with me. See you next time.